It's not a volcano. It's not a bomb crater. It's not some natural disaster. It's what's left after you dig 200 feet straight into the earth every single day for 50 years. Take everything worth taking and just leave the rubble on top. Those kids are sledding on poison. Nobody told them. This is Picher, Oklahoma, population 0. It was once the most productive lead and zinc mining town in the history of the United States. The American government used every last ounce of it to win 2 world wars. Then they left. What happened to the people who stayed behind is one of the most heartbreaking, infuriating, and almost completely forgotten stories in this country. In the fall of 1913, a man named Harry Crawfish was standing on his land in the northeastern corner of Oklahoma, Quapaw Nation land. Land his people had been pushed onto after being forced out of Arkansas decades earlier. And he hit something: lead, zinc, the kind of deposit that makes mining company accountants go very, very quiet before they start smiling. Within months, they had a town. Within a few years, a city. By 1920, more than 9,000 people lived here. By 1926, 14,000. Over 200 mills running around the clock. 14,000 men underground every single day. 10 million pounds of ore pulled out of the earth every single day. $20 billion worth of ore between 1917 and 1947. From one small town in northeastern Oklahoma. The bullets that tore through the Somme. The shell casings left in the mud of Verdun. The zinc plating on American tanks rolling toward Germany. A lot of that came from the ground under Picher, Oklahoma. During the First World War, more than 50% of the lead and zinc used by the entire U.S. military came from right here. In World War II, the number was roughly the same. The town that helped America win its biggest conflicts would eventually be destroyed by the very industry that built it. But before we go any further, there's something that needs to be said plainly. The land Picher was built on didn't belong to the mining companies. It belonged to the Quapaw Nation. And after an 1897 act of Congress, Quapaw landowners could lease their allotments for mining. In theory, they'd receive royalties. In practice, the Bureau of Indian Affairs managed those royalties, and they managed them catastrophically badly. Only about 1 in 6 Quapaw landowners ever received the land lease payments and mineral royalties they were legally owed. The land that made fortunes. The land that armed America. The people it actually belonged to, largely cut out of it. Remember that. It matters at the end. In 1967, the ore ran out, or close enough that it wasn't worth the cost anymore. The mining companies packed up. The drills went quiet. The men lost their jobs, and they turned off the pumps. For decades, those pumps had been the only thing keeping millions of gallons of groundwater out of the mine shafts. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were pulling toxic water up and out and managing it. When the pump stopped, the water had nowhere to go but up. The U.S. Geological Survey documented exactly what happened to that aquifer. The water filling those shafts was saturated with sulfate, iron, lead, zinc, and cadmium. It seeped into the Boone Formation, the same rock formation that fed the region's drinking water wells. Into the wells, into the water families were drinking. 76,800 acre-feet of contaminated mine water sitting underground. That's roughly 100,000 Olympic swimming pools. By 1973, the water started showing up at the surface. By the late 1970s, Tar Creek, the waterway that ran right through town, had turned orange. Not murky, not brownish. Orange, the color of rust, the color of heavy metals dissolving in acid water. One former resident, Karen Harvey, remembered going swimming in the ponds as a child, and her hair turning orange and not washing out. She thought it was just the summer. What she didn't know, what nobody had told her, was that she was swimming in a chemical bath of heavy metals. What she thought was a sunburn from those summer swims was actually a chemical burn. Karen Harvey is dyslexic today. Her IQ tests significantly below average. She wonders, as she has for decades, how much of that was the water, the soil, the dust blowing off those hills she played on as a child. She will never know for certain. And that might be the cruelest part of all of this. In 1980, the state of Oklahoma ran tests on the water and soil in Picher. The results confirmed what the Orange Creek had already been saying for years. Heavy metals, everywhere. In the water, in the soil, in the air. 3 years later, in September 1983, the EPA made it official. Picher was designated as part of the Tar Creek Superfund site, the federal government's list of the most dangerously contaminated places in the entire country. Number 1 on the priority list. When the EPA started systematic soil testing across Picher's neighborhoods, the numbers were staggering. Lead concentrations in Picher yard soil were 8 times higher than in a comparable community outside the contamination zone. Cadmium was 10 times higher. By 1996, an EPA emergency response team had sampled more than 2,000 homes. 65% of them had lead concentrations above the action level, the threshold at which the government says you have to act. Those chat piles weren't just sitting there looking ugly. They were releasing lead dust into the air every time the wind blew. And the wind in northeastern Oklahoma blows constantly. A study tracking airborne lead from 2010 to 2016 found that even years after the last resident had left, after the town had been empty for years, airborne lead levels in Picher were still 2 to 5 times higher than in Tulsa. Even a ghost town keeps poisoning the air around it. In 1994, the Indian Health Service tested blood lead levels in Native American children living in the Tar Creek area. 34 to 35% of them had lead concentrations above the CDC's threshold, the level at which neurological damage becomes a documented medical risk. In 1996, the Oklahoma State Health Department ran a broader survey of all children in Picher. That number rose to 38%. The state average was 2%, 1 in 3 children, 19 times the state rate, in a town where kids had been playing on chat piles and swimming in contaminated ponds their entire childhoods. Let me be clear about what lead poisoning actually does to a child, because the clinical language can make it sound abstract. It damages the brain before it has finished developing. It slows growth. It causes learning disabilities that don't go away. Behavioral problems, hearing loss, reduced IQ, the damage is largely permanent. The CDC now says there is no safe level of lead in a child's blood. None. 0. The EPA responded by removing the top 6 to 10 inches of topsoil from residents' yards, scraping the surface, laying down clean soil on top of poisoned ground. It helped a little. It was nowhere near enough, because the problem wasn't 6 inches deep. It was 200 feet deep, and it was directly beneath the entire town. While everyone was focused on the contamination in the air, the soil, and the water, a second disaster had been quietly developing underground for decades. The miners hadn't just dug tunnels, they had removed the support pillars. The support pillars were columns of rock left in place to hold the cavern ceilings up, standard mining practice. But those pillars contained ore, and ore meant money. So one by one, they came down. A former miner named Jack Green, who worked beneath Picher from 1938 to 1941, remembered the tremors from the mines shaking pencils right off the desks at school. He said they let people destroy this country from being so greedy. When the mines flooded with contaminated water after 1967, the water didn't just poison the aquifer, it dissolved and weakened what was left of the rock structure. And slowly, the ground that Picher sat on began to collapse. Sinkholes opened in streets, in yards, in the middle of the night, with no warning at all. One documented collapse left a hole 250 feet wide, filled with orange water. The year before it opened, you could see 3 mine shaft openings at that exact spot. Nobody knew which spot would be next. That's what made it so terrifying. The whole town was built above a void, and there was no map telling you where the floor would hold and where it wouldn't. In 2006, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers completed a full structural assessment of Picher. They looked at every building. They mapped the mine voids below. They overlaid the two. The number they came back with was not a number a town can survive. 86% of all buildings in Picher, including the school where children were still sitting in class, were found to be directly above mine voids, at imminent risk of collapse, at any time. Without warning, the government began offering buyouts to residents, and a lot of people took them, but a lot of people didn't, because this was home, because their parents were buried in the ground here, because they had built their whole lives in this place, and leaving felt like admitting that everything they'd worked for had been for nothing. Former Mayor Orville Ray said it plainly. You don't just walk away from your town. You don't let them tell you your whole life was built on poison, and that's that. Go on now. People fought to stay because this place meant something. On the morning of May 10th, 2008, an EF4 tornado touched down near the Kansas-Oklahoma border and tracked directly through Picher. 6 people died. At least 150 were injured. More than 150 homes were wiped flat. 20 blocks of the town were simply gone. The federal government surveyed the damage, and they made a decision. They would not fund the rebuilding of Picher. The buyouts would continue as planned. For the people who had held on through the superfund designation, through the soil samples, through the sinkholes, the people who had refused to leave because they believed something would change, this was the moment. Not the moment the tornado took their houses, the moment the government gave them their answer. There is no coming back from this. There was never going to be. By June 2009, the last federal buyout checks had been written. The last families had packed their things and driven away. On September 1st, 2009, the state of Oklahoma officially disincorporated Picher. The city ceased to exist. After 91 years, a handful of people refused to leave. They called themselves the Chat Rats. They stayed in their houses and watched the demolition crews take the town down around them, building by building, block by block. One man stayed longer than almost anyone else. Gary Linderman. He ran the old miners' pharmacy on Highway 69. He'd been in Picher since 1975. He had watched everything. The contamination reports, the buyouts, the tornado, the demolitions. He kept the pharmacy open. He said he'd stay as long as anyone needed him. He believed, genuinely and stubbornly, that Picher would come back, that there would be a resurgence in time. Gary Linderman died on June 9th, 2015. He was 60 years old. The pharmacy closed with him. There was no resurgence. The cleanup of the Tar Creek Superfund site has been ongoing since 1984. That is over 40 years. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Between 2005 and 2010, workers removed approximately 2.15 million tons of chat from the site. The estimated total when mining ended was somewhere between 165 and 300 million tons. The math is not encouraging. In 2021, American Rivers listed Tar Creek as one of the 10 most endangered rivers in the United States. Still contaminated, still running orange, still carrying heavy metals downstream. Climate change is making it worse. When extreme rain events hit the region, contaminated water runs off the chat piles and spreads further than anyone originally modeled. The contamination doesn't stay in Picher, it travels. The Quapaw Nation, the people whose land this was before any of this began, are still here. They have been active partners in the cleanup alongside the EPA and the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality. Their involvement isn't just logistical. This was their land. It was taken from them, leased without full consent or fair compensation, mined to exhaustion, and left to them contaminated. And they are still showing up to clean it. That is worth saying out loud. I need you to sit with something before this ends. Picher is not an isolated case. Right now, the EPA's Superfund National Priority List includes over 1,300 sites, the absolute worst contaminated places in the country. There are an estimated 557,000 abandoned mines across the United States. Most of them are not being actively cleaned up. Most of the people who live near them have no idea what was extracted from the ground beneath their feet, or what was left behind when the companies left. Picher was a sacrifice. The town, the people, the Quapaw Nation's land. It was given up for wartime production and for profit, and then largely forgotten when there was nothing left to take. The least we owe them is to know the name. If this story moved you enough to do something, look up whether there's a Superfund site near where you live. The EPA's database is public and searchable at epa.gov/Superfund. It is full of stories like this one that have never been told on camera. If you're in Oklahoma, or if you care about indigenous land rights anywhere, learn about the Quapaw Nation's environmental programs. Their fight for this land did not end in 2009. And if you teach, if there are young people who trust you to show them the full picture, consider adding Picher to the conversation. The same industrial era we celebrate for winning wars has an environmental and human cost that is still being paid today by people who never saw a dime of the profits. That's not a footnote. That's the story. The chat piles are still there. The creek still runs orange. And somewhere under the ground, The water is still rising.